What do we mean by causality? This is an interesting question because I believe that most of our disagreements about how reality works and what you can explain in reality, how you can predict reality, even take political questions like wars and what position you take in a specific situation, in a war situation. Most of those assume some kind of understanding of what causality is because we usually take those positions, for example, defending a specific war or fighting against it, based on conceptions of what caused the event, what the root cause is, and what would make things different. So we have to assume some kind of understanding of what causality is. Yet our everyday understanding of causality is very primitive and not apt to grasp and capture the complexity of life surrounding us. In our everyday understanding, I think what we mean by causality is what Searle has been calling push-pull causality. The idea is something like one object literally pushing another object out of its position, or one object pulling at another object so that it moves. These, of course, are metaphors that are deduced from our corporal existence, right? When you sit somewhere and somebody else moves into your seat, then you're not sitting there anymore. Or when somebody's pulling you by the arm, you're going to move. And it's something that you understand even as a child, long before you have any conscious concepts about causality. You already experience causality firsthand. The first moment you push something and it reacts to your pushing gesture as a child, you can clearly distinguish that from pushing a house and the house not reacting to your pushing gesture. Those are very embodied, very basic distinctions that we learn long before we can speak or even consciously think about them. And they serve as the foundation for how we conceive of more complex phenomena. This is described in detail in Mark Johnson and George Lakoff's theories around how we build a world coming from such foundational experiences that we basically take for granted and don't think much about because they're so obvious to us and they're so primary. They're oftentimes even pre-linguistic. And we take them for granted and we construct an entire subjective world that seems to us highly differentiated, new, interesting, and yet has at its foundation certain experiences that we all human beings share. And one of those experiences is the experience of push-pull causality, right? Everybody understands causality in these terms, that when you push something, it either moves away or it shows some kind of resistance and doesn't move away. This is the foundation for what we usually conceive to be physical causality. So the naive way of thinking about causality, the pre-scientific way of thinking about causality, is to think that reality is composed of things that are billiard ball-like. So when we're speaking of atoms, the naive understanding of what an atom is, it's just a small billiard ball. And the movements of the small billiard ball, the pushing and the pulling, determines everything in the universe. And once you know the movements of the billiard ball, the smallest, you at the same time also will know the movement of everything else. You will know all the movements that are out there, even the movements of the stars, of entire galaxies, from the smallest to the greatest. Once you know the movements of one single particle, or all particles that are out there in the universe, you can predict every possible state in the universe from that kind of knowledge. Now it turns out this is not how causality works. This is a pre-scientific understanding of causality. What actually turns out to be much more adequate is to distinguish different forms of causality. And I'll try doing that. So I'll start with 4 different types of causality that are clearly distinct from each other and irreducible to each other. So when we're speaking about one form of causality, it cannot explain away a different form of causality. For this, we can use Ken Wilber's quadrant model. So the idea here is simply that the world, when we're looking at it, appears to us at least from 4 very foundationally different perspectives. And those 4 perspectives are so basic, they're so foundational, that even the different disciplines in academia that we've developed to study the world are falling into those four different quadrants or four different primordial perspectives. And they're so foundational that they're even expressed in the language we use. So our languages are generally making a distinction between first, second, and third person. So you can distinguish a statement which describes an I perspective, a we perspective, and an it perspective. I, we, it. You have the pronouns which are available to us, and we all kind of understand them, even though we don't really think about them because we take them for granted. Now, these pronouns express something very deep about how we human beings are making sense about reality. The it perspective, when you're looking at something and treating it as an it, you're looking at it from your sensual apparatus as how it appears from a physical perspective, as how it appears having a shape, having a form that is visible, how it moves through space, how it moves through time, what colors it has, any kind of property that is related to a sensual experience of the respective phenomenon. This is the it perspective. So in everyday language, when we're saying that we're treating a human being as an it, if you were to throw a human being from the tower in Pisa, for example, you could do Galileo could have done his experiments. This is once a professor of us told us. Galileo could have done his experiments on gravity instead of using objects, using human beings. And the results would have been the same. But then he would have used those human beings as mere objects, as mere its. That's the it perspective. When you treat something as just merely extended, as just merely a composition of different mechanisms coming together, as different parts coming together and forming a whole. And when you don't treat it as something that is experience. That's the I perspective. When we're speaking from the I perspective, the first person perspective, the first person pronoun, we're usually speaking about the consciousness, the interiority of a given object, or in this case, human being. So we're speaking about things that manifest in your conscious life. The moment you wake up from a deep, dreamless sleep, you wake up to a world of experiences of various kinds. You have intentions, you have beliefs, you have mental images, you have fears. All kinds of mental content is there. And all of that stuff has very different qualities from physical objects. But physical objects, you can say things like they have a certain speed of movement. They have a certain size. You couldn't say that of mental stuff, right? First person stuff. First person stuff doesn't have a size, it doesn't have a color. But on the other hand, about first person stuff, you can say things like valid. You can say an idea is valid. It has validity. You couldn't say that about a third person object, an it. You couldn't say a computer has validity, right? These are entirely different realms and perspectives through which we experience reality. So added to those, the it perspective and the I perspective, you can add the we perspective. And the we perspective is not just a multiplication of individual I's or individual beliefs. Oftentimes, sociologists were trying to think of society as nothing but a multiplication of individuals. So when you place many individuals together who have their own individual minds, the result will be social structures and social forms. It turns out that social structures have their own dynamic, which is kind of not in a single individual's mind. You couldn't point to it and say, well, look, this is the thing that's the social structure and it's in the mind of one individual. Social structures themselves have their own dynamic, and individuals can participate in those dynamics, but they can't exhaustively capture them. So, in other words, the social dimension is something that transcends the individual aspect. Although, without the individual, of course, the social wouldn't exist. It's not something that's independent from the individual. So the we space or the social dimension are, for example, all the things that you don't know how to do when you enter a new culture. Wilber has often been given the example, look, when you come to participate in a new culture, everything's foreign to you. The rituals that you observe are things, literally things to you, because you don't know the meaning of the things that people are doing. They're just something observable. You have to participate in it. You have to communicate to the respective members to actually get at the point, get at the meaning of those cultural phenomena. So you have to engage understanding to get at the heart of the we space, right? To create an I-thou relationship, you have to understand the other side. And in this context, you have to understand an entire culture. And the fourth dimension which we could add to the whole thing is the perspective of plural its, if you want. It's the systemic dimension, which represents, for example, institutions. Take the, academic institution. There are certain rules of how things are done that are not necessarily the result of somebody having invented those rules and thought about those rules, but oftentimes the result of internal structures that are part of the system itself. So, for example, in academia, you have the rule publish or perish, right? That's not something that one individual came up with and invented, but it is the result of multiple mechanisms pushing against each other and forcing, for example, students to oftentimes write more than they have to say, and oftentimes write things they don't themselves understand, or oftentimes present ideas that are not their own as their own. So there are many rules that come into existence, and they are real as rules, and everybody knows that these rules have consequences for other domains as well. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why academia is almost dead today. At least the link between everyday consciousness and the academic sphere is severely damaged. And this systems perspective, if you want, is the fourth quadrant, or its own, if you want, dimension of how we make sense of reality. And the interesting part here is that with this, we have already 4 dimensions of causality that have very, very different types of things that count as causes. Yet all of them have their own causal principles. In all of the dimensions, in all of the quadrants, you have causality, yet the forms of causality are very different. And Wilber's model is useful because it gives you a foundational taxonomy. Starting with those 4, you can actually figure out, adding more distinctions on top of that you can come up with dozens of different forms of causality that are irreducible to each other. Now let's go into the details of that stuff. And I used AI for help to come up with some good examples. So let's take the first person perspective, the subjective perspective when we look at the world. What's the stuff that can have causal relevance there? Individual beliefs, concrete individual beliefs, like, for example, the belief that I wanted to meet you at 12 o'clock, but you thought we would meet at 11 o'clock. So my false belief is the actual reason for me not appearing at the right time. Right? This is a first-person reason, and it's a perfectly reasonable way of speaking of cause in this context. It's not too metaphorical, or it's not too loose. It is still very much related to the push-pull causality of which we usually think causality to perform. But the pushing and pulling here doesn't happen between objects. It happens between mental states and between beliefs. When we look at the it perspective, the individual perspective, the third-person perspective, things that can be causes there are, for example, elevated cortisol levels, which causes a hippocampal volume shrinkage. So when you have chronic stress, which elevates cortisol, you have neuron death and measurable hippocampal shrinkage. This is a different kind of cause from the first one that we described, where a belief can cause certain behavior. Now you can look up more examples. I mean, AI can come up with dozens of examples for each and every quadrant. I just want to briefly cover all of them. So we had the individual subjective and the individual objective, the it perspective. Now let's look to the we perspective, the cultural perspective. Take, for example, cultural norms like politeness. So when you want to greet somebody, You have an individual intention, you want to do something, but when you bow to greet the person, that intention is not the reason for you to bow. The reason for you to bow is that you know what the customs are within a given culture. And you know that within that specific culture, bowing is an expression of respect and the way of greeting another person. In other words, you wouldn't be bowing if you were not participating in a certain culture. This is a cultural reason. This is a cultural reason for you to do something. And if you didn't know the culture, you would not perform the act, or you might even do the wrong thing. I read somewhere that in certain, I don't know whether it was tribes or cultures, looking at each other's eyes was not treated as a form of respect, but the opposite, as an attempt to provoke the other side or to dominate, even dominate the other side, right? So your intention to actually be polite here expresses itself through the action that is interpreted on the other side as being an act of aggression, right? So you have to know the culture as well. And notice how you can't really reduce the one thing to the other. You can't reduce the intention to the cultural agreement that people have between each other, nor can you do it the other way around. The intention is still something different from the cultural norm and expectation. And yet again, it's something different from the mental states. You might correlate it with the respective brain states accompanying those actions, but you cannot reduce it to each other. In other words, you couldn't say the existence of a cultural norm exists as this specific form in the brain. This is what it is in the brain, right? Because you can make cultural linkages that you couldn't make on the level of the brain. For example, you could say a specific cultural rule is the result of another rule, is the result of another rule, and those are grounded in certain intentions. These are perfectly valid and meaningful statements, and statements which actually make reality comprehensible to you, which you could not make coming from the purely third-person brain perspective of looking at somebody's cortisol levels or whatever you look at the brain. You couldn't make those predictions that you can once you are moving in a specific domain. Once we are in a specific causal domain, we can make predictions and we can speak about causal connections meaningfully. But we can't make those across domains in meaningful ways. And the last example is the systemic example, the plural its perspective, if you want. I kind of already mentioned it. Bureaucratic rules are a good example for that. For example, when you have structural constraints in academia, for example, publish or perish. This is a rule that is generated by systems and system interactions. And oftentimes they force us into actions that we otherwise wouldn't perform, but are necessary for us to actualize individual intentions, right? And we have to coordinate all those. So now we have 4 different domains, and those are 4 different types of causality, and they are significantly different from each other, even though all of them are still relatable to the much more foundational experience of something pushing something else or something pulling something else, right? This is something that is at the heart of all of those. The impression in the systemic perspective, for example, in the its perspective, we can speak about functional fit, but still the metaphor is applicable, that certain distinctions are the cause for something else. And now the interesting part, which I didn't think about, is that you can actually multiply this. So you have now 4 different types of causality that are, all of them are as much causality as you can get. It's not that you could say that one of those forms of causality is more foundational than the other ones. If it were, you could deduce the other ones from it, but it's not something that you can do. You can't deduce, for example, first-person experiences and intentions from third-person brain states in an immediate way, in the sense that I'm observing the brain and I know why you have to experience what you experience now, necessarily so by just looking at the brain. What we can do is correlation. We can look at the brain and ask a person, what are you experiencing? But we can never immediately jump from observing a brain without knowing anything about human beings and how they express themselves and speak about their internal states immediately, right? There's no way of immediately getting from one of those domains into the other. Just by knowing, I think this is something that you all know, right? Just by virtue of being a very good, I don't know, physicist or someone who's working with brains all day, this doesn't make you a good historian. When you're a historian, you have your own causal categories and you have your own foundational frames in which you think about reality, and you're trying to relate those to each other, and you learn about those, you know more about those than the average person, and you know how events are causally connected to other events, you know the details about those events. None of those things, events, someone looking at your brain knows about. So if someone is looking at your brain, they wouldn't know about the French Revolution. There is no immediate way of knowing about any of those other dimensions by just looking at somebody's brain. I mean, it would be weird, wouldn't it? I mean, but just looking at somebody's brain, if somebody was able to basically reconstruct human history from that. Human history is different from brain physiology. Now, the interesting part that I hadn't thought about is if you connect this one with the idea that you have more elements of integral theory, like the quadrants or these 4 different dimensions of existence are just one basic distinction. But you can go further. You can add the idea of levels, for example. And this itself, too, adds different causal domains. For example, when you have a development perspective, let me find it, where was it? Yeah, so you can have in the first person dimension, which we already opened up, once you introduce the notion of levels, you can have preconceptual affective causality. So the way affects, for example, influence actions. This is pre-rational. You can have conceptual, so belief, desire forms of causality. So you're already operating with concepts, with certain narratives. And here narratives can be the cause for somebody's actions. On the pre-rational, or the animal level if you want, this doesn't exist. Animals don't act out of beliefs. You can have metacognitive causality. So you can have somebody's self-awareness causing certain kinds of action, right? Someone becoming aware of their action, like, and experiencing some form of shame being one of the higher emotions that we experience, or if you want, self-reflective emotions. Not all emotions are like that. Certain emotions are about how we are as human beings, right? So reflective, metacognitive causality is also its own form, a different form of causality. And the same thing goes, by the way, with, this was the first person perspective. If you look at the third person perspective, and the AI makes distinctions here, which I don't understand yet because I don't know enough about the areas. It makes, for example, the distinction between atomic causation, chemical causation being different from atomic causation. I just don't know enough about these areas to understand what it means by that. Biological causation being also different from those, and neurobiological causation being different from those again. And then it gives just rough examples that metabolism is different, a different form of causality than the relationships that are established between atoms, where you don't have metabolism yet. I don't understand enough about these areas to really understand what AI is talking about here. I would have to go, because I'm working with very naive understanding here. I'm working with really pre-rational understanding here, that you have things, and those things somehow relate to each other. But it appears that metabolism is not something that you can conceptualize as just things bumping into each other. It is its own causational, if you want, dimension. And the same goes, by the way, once you introduce the notion of levels, it is true of the lower left, so the quadrant, which is the we space, the symbolic space. For example, mythic causation, like rituals or taboos, are different from rational legal causation, from pluralistic causation, where the idea is that you have pluralistic identities of people. This is really interesting. This is really interesting that you can basically multiply the different forms of causality And you can add more and more elements, and the more elements you add, the more types of causality you get. And what AI can come up with is that basically you can distinguish not only dozens, I mean, the foundational types, if you want, or dimensions of causality really seem to be those four. So you have four big dimensions of causality: causality in the subjective realm, causality in the intersubjective realm, causality in the individual objective, and in the plural objective realm. But those have many sub dimensions of causality that can be differentiated. And the AI suggests there are actually hundreds, thousands. If you reduce the metaphysically, it calls it metaphysically irrelevant ones, you still come down to at least a few dozen different types of causality that are irreducible to each other and that are all meaningful and express something about reality that other types of causality cannot exhaustively describe and explain. And let me give you just a short example. This is often a topic that has been raised. You can approach any kind of complex topic from this four quadrant approach, which has at least those four types of causalities, and then falling back into many more subtypes. So let's take the question of depression. So when you analyze depression, you can have in the third person dimension of causes, you can have all kinds of causes like neurochemical causation. You can have genetic predisposition. You can have neuroanatomical causation, like the reduced hippocampal volume, right? Connected to impaired mood regulation. You can have medication side effect causation. And you can have behavioral biological feedback causation, like social withdrawal for weeks and reduced sensory stimulation. All of those are still just third person, its dimension, if you want, causes. And equally much as involved can be upper left causes, so the individual intentional level. So you can have belief systems or individual beliefs that are harmful to you, like I'm a failure, nothing will improve. Individual beliefs that are there for some reason that are hindering you. You can have affective emotional causation. So, for example, unresolved grief as an enduring affective tone of sadness that is there. You can have volitional, intentional causation, like a deep sense of purposelessness and weakened intention and agency. You can have self-interpretation issues, like how you interpret yourself as a person, how you see yourself. For example, I'm broken, I'm a failure, yada, yada, yada. You can come up with many of those. And you can have a trauma state causation relation here. So there might be experiences from childhood triggered by certain stimuli. You can trigger certain forms of experiences that are followed by depressive shutdown. This was the first person perspective. Then you can have the cultural perspective, where you have yet again different kinds of causes, like cultural shame causation. You have cultures where certain kind of behavior is disapproved of and has the status of being something that is dishonorable, right? You can internalize shame. You can have family systems causation, if you want. So the family narrative, like for example, we endure silently, and emotions are weakness. This is a cultural thing as well. Again, we understand it and we learn something about the world by not treating it as something else, but by looking at this narrative as a narrative. Emotion is weakness. We don't reduce it to neural firing. We don't reduce it to history, to human history. We don't reduce it to brain structures. But we have to treat it as exactly what it is, namely narrative, to understand it and to be able to change it and work with it. Then culturally assigned roles. We're still in the cultural dimension. For example, assigned identity, like you have to be a provider, You have to be the strong one, the successful one, and so on. I mean, dozens of examples you could come up with. Then language world causation, still in the cultural sphere. For example, if you lack the vocabulary to speak about certain emotional states, if you can't articulate them, you won't be able to work with them. You won't be able to tap into them and actualize them. And then shared belief, of course, like when you have normalized nihilism, for example, like group mass phenomena that are harmful, like ideas that nothing matters, materialism, in the sense of personal identity doesn't matter, just buy stuff, it will solve your problems, and so on. And then you have systemic or structural, environmental, if you want, causes, which again are their own domain of causes. Like, something that's very presently, I think, a topic that many of us are struggling with, like job insecurity, for example, or rising costs, workplace structure causation, like corporate structures, which you are not only a member but part of. Urban environment causation, like green spaces. Technological system causations, like how you use social media, different forms of addiction that are connected with that, and healthcare system causation. You can yada yada. You can break it down into many more causal influences. And look how the interesting part here again is none of that is reducible to a physicalist form of causation, where you could speak only about the existence of molecules or atoms. If we did, we would lose significant parts of the cosmos, as Wilber uses the word to describe the entirety of existence. We would lose significant parts of reality if we were to speak in terms of molecules or in terms of atoms even, and try to capture all the things that we already know about reality in terms of one single domain of causal relationships, or of mechanistic, if you want, causal relationships. We would lose all those other things that we already know about reality. And that's the approach that Integral has been trying to walk. It has been trying to coordinate those. So it basically assumes that all those approaches, all those narratives have their own validity, and they wouldn't exist if they didn't capture some aspect of reality. And the interesting part is, how do you make them work together so that they can learn from each other and come up with solutions that have taken all those different voices and all those different perspectives into account and have been informed by them before making decisions. Because it seems that in any complex situation, you have to consider all those dimensions because they're simply there. They are part of reality. And it's not a coincidence that we have developed languages, entire languages and ways of thinking about them. Like history, it has its own language, has its own way of thinking about reality, and historicity as well, which is a sub-school of history, for example. It deals with history as a history of consciousness, if you want, a history of ideas. And those schools, those languages would not have developed if they didn't capture something about reality, even if only how we experience reality as human beings. Even if that was the only thing they captured as a language, it's still some form of knowledge that you cannot want simply represent in a different form of knowledge by just knowing about atoms and molecules. It wouldn't replace this kind of knowledge. You still would have to tap into it and see what it makes visible to you. And it's the overall picture. The overall picture is that a few hundred years ago, I think we thought of causality as something that is simple, that is single, and that works from the bottom to the top. So we have bottom-up causality. Once you grasp the causality of particles, the idea was you grasp the causality of the entire universe. It turned out this is not itself a very solid scientific picture of how causality works. And it does not only not provide you the entire universe, it cannot even account for all the things that we already know and have been speaking about for millennia. it cannot capture, it cannot, it cannot, run up to and capture all the things that we already know about human beings by virtue of using these different kind of languages to speak about different forms of causation.